Okay, hello again. We are live on the Edlow podcast. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I am here with another very special guest. Hello, neighbor, Ned Telford.
How
How
you
are
doing?
you?
How you doing, Josh? I'm great.
Great. So, Ned Telford wears many hats. I've known him for about 5 years now. He lives right next door to me. He was the first person I met. I was looking through the house that I live in now in Folsom, California, and as I walk through, he's outside. I think you were fixing a basketball hoop for your grandkids or something like that. And we
Yep, I
got to,
was. And we
yeah,
put it together wrong.
did you? And I remember talking to you and saying that I was a member of the church, and then you said, "Well, I'd be your stake president," and I was like, "Oh, that's not good." and so and so I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to live next to a stake president, but it's been a great experience. And as I've gotten to know you, I've really enjoyed your story, and I find it kind of remarkable that your kind of journey, your faith journey, from being a less active member virtually your whole life until your 20s, right? And then
Yep.
moving on. So let's start there. Where did you grow up? Tell me about your parents.
Well, I was born in Salt Lake City. My parents moved out here when I was 2 years old, so I have no memory, of course, of living in Salt Lake. And they moved to the Sacramento area. Um, my dad never graduated from high school. He was a smart guy,
Mm-hmm.
but in his generation, he was born in 1916.
Mm-hmm.
And he grew up pretty poor, so the idea of him going to college wasn't really in the mix for where he was and where he was. But he ended up when he was out here, he was in management for a trucking company, a nationwide trucking company that worked out of Salt Lake City called IML Freight, which has since gone under.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was the terminal manager for their terminal here in the Sacramento area. My mom, for the most part, was a stay-at-home mom until I got into high school, and then she worked for. I take it back. When we were younger, she worked as a buyer for a department store, which is, again has gone out of business, called Rhodes Department Store.
Mm-hmm.
And she was a buyer for young girls in terms of buying their clothing. And then when they went out of business, she went to work for the state of California and worked there, kind of working her way up into management positions and retired from that. Both my parents are deceased, and they were good parents.
Yeah.
Good there, and nothing to worry about there.
Yeah. Well, and tell me where you are in the birth order as far as brothers and sisters.
I am the last of four.
Ah, the
I have a,
baby.
I have a sister who is 13. Yeah, that is such a benefit to be the baby. Your parents focus on the older kids. And
Yeah.
I apologized to my son, who's our oldest, that we had to practice on him.
Yep.
And so I'm the youngest of four. I have an older sister who is 13 years older than me, who's passed away. I have an older brother who's 10 years older than me, who is alive and well. And then there's 8 years between the babies, and that's because my mom had five miscarriages between number three and number four.
Wow.
So then I've got a brother who's 2 years older than me, who's alive and well, and then me, the baby. And so by the time they got to me, they had basically figured out that nothing they could do as parents really made much difference. Kids just turned out as they were. And so I was kind of left alone in a loving sort of way, in the sense that I always felt loved by my parents, but they weren't necessarily that much involved in my life as a teenager growing up. I was kind of on my own, which I don't look back. I look back on it as a positive. How's that?
Hmm. Interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah, it's funny what you said. I think the same thing. I recently, uh, Austin, my oldest, he looks at the way I treat Lincoln. He goes, if I would have done that when I was that age, you would have done this and that. And I go, well, we sorry we screwed you up. It's just like I'll pay for your therapy later. And
But
so
it's just part of being a parent. Like my oldest, Justin, who is now 47 years old. So he was a thumb sucker. And so that really bothered me when he was like 4 and 5 years old, or not quite, probably 4 years old, sucking his thumb. And so I worried about it, talked to the dentist, and we put him through a thumb sucking program that we paid through the nose to the dentist to put him through this thumb sucking program to get him off thumb sucking. So then you go, and there aren't, my kids are spread out. There's 17 years from the oldest to the youngest. So Kelsey, the youngest, she sucked her thumb. We could care less. We knew that it would come to her.
Yeah,
No
right.
need for an intervention by the dentist to put her through a thumb sucking program.
I
So
remember. I remember. I think it was Lexi. We were struggling a little bit. I struggled a little bit because potty training was so difficult, and with her, I think it was Lexi. I can't remember which one it was, but I remember the best advice I ever got was they said someone in my ward at the time said, "Listen, how many adults do you see walking around with diapers on?" She'll figure it out eventually, you know. And so, little patience.
yeah, so I grew up in Sacramento from 2 years on. Lived in the same house from the time we moved there until I got married, um, and just went to high school and wasn't much of an athlete, but that's okay and fun.
Well, that's good. So, tell me now, as far as your relationship to the church, how did that work out as you were going through your teenage years?
Well, I think when it's hard to know for sure. I think my mom was relatively active when they lived in Utah. I think my dad was probably completely inactive, but not really sure. But I know all through my life he smoked and he drank, and I'm sure he smoked from the time they got married up until later. And so once they got out to Utah or out of Utah to Sacramento, they just kind of drifted away from the church, and so we didn't go to church. I have an older sister who had, established a testimony and a love for the church, and so she continued to go to church on her own all the time when I was growing up. But we didn't really, we didn't go. And so I was baptized when I was 8 years old. But other than going back to Utah to visit relatives, to go to church, we never went to church.
Hmm.
And so I was never involved in the Aaronic priesthood program, never involved in scouts, never held any priesthood until I was, like you say, in my 20s and married.
Hmm. Okay.
So I was familiar that there was something called the Book of Mormon, but I'd never read a word of it.
Hmm.
I guess I was familiar that there was the word of wisdom,
Hmm.
um, but obviously it didn't have a lot of impact because my parents were, both my parents were not living the word of wisdom, and so it just wasn't, was what it was. And
Hmm.
so when I first met my wife, and we'll kind of get into that a little later, but we never really talked about religion. And it's so scary to think that you marry someone and you never talk about one of the most important things that will affect your life and your eternity, and yet you pick a spouse without even talking about that. And that gets back to kind of the tender mercies of the Lord, who kind of, I think, watches over people who, because of their circumstances, kind of watches out for them and says, okay, we'll wait for Ned to come to a different point in his life, and then we'll intervene because we really can't do much now because he's not really listening.
Hmm. That's a good point. A couple of things you said there. I like my parents. Very similar situation. My dad, convert to the church, Jewish, and I remember my mom tells me the story that when she first started dating my dad, my grandfather, who was, I mean, he's got ancestry all the way back to the very beginning of the church. I mean, they're staunch, hardcore members. He voiced a little bit of concern. He said, "Well, he's not a member of the church, and he's not even Christian. How are you going to work that out?" And she said, "Oh, Dad, it's not like I'm going to marry him." and then and then they get married, and they'd had lots of conversations about that. And so tell me then, as far as going through high school, what was your high school experience like?
It was good. I had friends. I felt like I fit in. Um, but, kind of going back to the way I was raised is that, um, once you got to be about 14 or 15 years old, you were on your own for money and everything else.
Oh, interesting.
And so my first job was McDonald's. I worked at McDonald's, and that was so long ago that when I first started working at McDonald's, only boys were allowed to work at McDonald's. It was
Oh,
just a
wow.
whole male establishment. When I say make a comment like that to somebody your age, they go, "Come on, you got to be kidding me!" No, it's exactly the way it was. And so,
Wow.
um, and I've always looked, not now, but as a kid growing up, I always looked younger than I was. I matured later than I should have been. And so I somehow convinced the people at McDonald's I was 16 when I was only 15, which was a joke because I looked about 12. And so I fudged on my birthday by a year and got a job at McDonald's. And so I worked a lot after school and doing all that. And I started getting that job when I was 15. So I'd saved up enough money when I turned 16 to buy a car. And so, but because I had to have a car because my parents were not in the mix in terms of taking me to work or getting me to school. That was completely my responsibility. But I didn't resent that. That's just the way it was. And so I got this car, and you can appreciate this. It was let's see, at 16, it would have been 1969 when I turned 16. And so I purchased a 1967 Mustang. John
Nice.
said a nice Mustang. And so
Yeah.
I had this nice little Mustang, and that was good.
Yeah.
And so mostly I worked, saved my money and did all that. And then once I got the car, then all the money I worked at went to fixing the car and putting bigger tires on it and doing all sorts of stupid stuff that you do and
Sure.
putting gas in it. But gas was only 25 cents a gallon.
Yeah.
But working at McDonald's, I earned, where's the drum roll? I earned $1.25 an hour.
Wow.
But it was a great experience because back then you could have a tremendous amount of responsibility. So by the time I was 16, I was a shift manager, if you can imagine that.
Yeah.
And so I'd be responsible for about 15, men working, boys working on the shift, counting the money, taking it to the bank, making orders for how many burgers and buns that we needed to have in the next couple of days, and doing the inventory. And I got to watch how a business is run. And it was a great experience for me. Didn't make a lot of money at it, but it was a great experience.
Enough to keep up a Mustang though, so that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now you get to college. Where did you go to college?
I started out right after high school. I went to Sacramento City College because it just seemed like the thing to do because I wasn't really I wasn't really thinking, how's that? I just thought, well, I guess I ought to go to college. I was the first one in my family to go to college, even at that point. And so I enrolled in Sac City College and did quite well. And it kind of spurred me on and made a friend who was going to Santa Clara University. And so I felt like I really wanted to go to a university. And so at the end of 2 years, I transferred to Berkeley, which is where I graduated from.
Nice. And then you eventually also end up at law school. Where did you go? Did you go to Berkeley for law school as well?
No, I went to law school here in Sacramento at McGeorge.
Oh, okay.
Same as you.
Same as me. There you go.
Yeah.
Wow. Where was it ranked when you were going there? Was it ranked?
Yeah, well, no, it wasn't. I don't even know if they had rankings, but it wasn't. But it was interesting. McGeorge was, at that time, McGeorge had the reputation of a third of the class would be flunked out over the period of 3 years of the day program.
Oh, yeah.
So 1/3 would be gone. But for when I was there, they had the highest bar percentage rate of any of the law schools in Sacramento or in California, including Bolt Hall and UC Davis and all those, because literally I used to think that the dean would flunk out anyone who thought he might pass or flunk the bar exam on the first time. And so it worked out fine. I got a good education. They prepared me to be a lawyer as much as any law school does. But
Yeah. Law school doesn't prepare you to be a lawyer at all.
no, and it wouldn't have been any different if I'd gone to Bolt Hall or any of the big name schools, and it was
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Awesome. So now, where in that process do you meet your wife and get married?
Now, this is almost embarrassing to tell you this story.
Okay.
So, I met my wife because we hired the first two females, girls, at the McDonald's store.
Oh.
She did not get hired, but we hired these two girls who were her friends. And
Oh.
so she came in with them. I got introduced to her. I got enough nerve to ask her out for a date, and we did. And so we started dating. And I proposed to her while she was a senior in high school. And so the last month of high school, she was wearing an engagement ring.
Wow.
And then
Wow.
married a year after that. We got married, and then I went off to Berkeley, and we got married between my junior and senior year in at Berkeley.
Wow. So how long did you date total?
Well, probably about 18 months.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
So by today's standards, that would probably be about right. You know, it's interesting because when you remember like my generation, I don't know if it was like this in the generation of people coming back from their missions back in the 70s, but you know, it's like I came back and people were getting married in a month, 2 months, 3 months. You know
Well,
what I mean?
we were we were just kids.
Yeah.
We had to wait a year and a half to be even
Yeah.
close.
Yeah. Yeah.
Karen was 19 and I was 20. How's that?
Yeah. Wow. So, what was were you when you went to college? When did you start deciding you wanted to be a lawyer?
Probably in my second year of college, I was looking around at something I thought that I would enjoy
Mm-hmm.
and that I thought I'd be good at. And the interesting thing is, when you think about that, is I had no idea. There are no lawyers in my family. I don't know what the idea that I picked being a lawyer because I thought I would enjoy it and I thought I'd be good at it was kind of nonsense in a way. But that's what I did. And so I did that. And then by the time I got to Berkeley, I was focused on doing that. Getting into law school. And so it was probably no different then than now. It's very competitive to get into to law schools. And so, you try to get good grades, so you get a decent score on the LSAT and, do the best you can. And then I ended up, got admitted to two law schools. One was Hastings, which was a little bit cheaper, but it was in San Francisco. One was obviously McGeorge in Sacramento, a little bit more expensive, but nothing compared to what it is today.
Mm.
And it was, at home where I lived and where Karen was from. And so it was kind of an easy choice.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So now tell me, you essentially would be considered because you would be considered a less active member up until this point. And where your wife, where was her? Was she an active member of the church, or was she
No,
not even a member yet?
she was not a member of the church. She grew up going to church as a young teen, like 13, 14 years old, a Methodist church. Her grandfather was a Methodist minister, and her great grandfather was a Methodist minister.
Wow.
And so, but the family that she grew up in was not really, as a family, going to church like what we would talk about in our
Mm-hmm.
church, where everybody went together.
Mm.
Uh, Her parents were divorced, and so she was living with her stepdad, and her mom remarried her stepdad when she was like 5 or 6 years old, pretty young.
Mm.
So, but by the time we met, she wasn't going to church at all. And as I said earlier, we didn't really have discussions about church.
Mm.
And I wasn't going to church, and just really didn't really give much thought as to whether there was a God and if he had a role in my life. It was just living life.
Mm. So, where does the church start coming into your life?
So now Karen and I are living in married student housing at Berkeley. It's called Albany Village. And so she was going to school at Merritt Junior College. And so she'd read a couple of books. One was Hal Lindsey's book, who's like a Christian author at the time. And so, and she was just doing this on her own without really discussing with me. I mean, and so she came to the conclusion that she wanted to know if Jesus Christ was real, and that, and if so, what did she need to do to establish a relationship with him? And so she got to this point, and while she was in the library at Merritt, she offered a prayer in there and had a really, really spiritual experience, kind of like what you would call in an evangelical way a born again experience. And so she came home and explained to me what happened and said, we need to go find a church. And so for the next month or so, we every weekend went to a different church. And after about a month, it's so silly when you say about this. I said, I'm a Mormon. And we've never had that conversation. I was baptized a Mormon, and I've got a lot of cousins who've served missionaries for the Mormon church, we would refer to it at that time. Why don't we ask them to come over? And so she goes, okay. And so somehow I got a hold of the missionaries. I don't know what I did. And within, a day or so, I had two missionaries knocking on our little apartment door at Albany Village. And so they started giving us the lessons. And so my non-member wife introduced me to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or reintroduced me.
Wow, that's so interesting. It's funny. So tell me, you often hear? I mean, I served a mission, and there were some investigators that were just golden investigators, like they were just ready to go. Would you think you were one of those, or were you a tough one for the missionaries to crack?
Oh, I was easy, and it wasn't that I was ready to go. I mean, going to church and doing all this because I was newly married and I wanted to make my wife happy. I had no interest in religion in my life. I just didn't feel like I needed it. Mm-hmm. And so that first time when the missionaries were there, they obviously left us with a copy of the Book of Mormon and gave us some stuff to read. Mm-hmm. And I read the entire Book of Mormon over the weekend.
Wow.
Well, isn't that big of a wow? Put yourself in college. You would read a 500-page book over the weekend all the time.
Sure. But I mean, considering that you're in college and you're studying and you're doing all that, you had time to read a 500-page book in between all that.
Well, I'm not sure that I had the time, but it just captivated me. And so I started reading it, and I could not put it down. It's not like I studied it. I just read it like a novel, going from place to place. And it just changed my life. I mean, in the sense that once I'd finished the Book of Mormon, I didn't have this great spiritual experience at the end where you pray and you get this great deal, but I came to know who I was as a child of God with an infinite and eternal potential. And I'd never thought about that before, but I'd come to realize that. And so I felt like I didn't need to make any changes in my life. I wasn't even 21, so I didn't drink. And I didn't smoke, but I did drink coffee. And I remember going to make a cup of coffee afterwards and saying, well, I better not do this if we're going to start going to the church. And so we just started going to church at the Berkeley ward, and people were so kind to us. My hair was down to my shoulders, which fit right in. Not necessarily in church, but it fit right in with Berkeley. And here's a funny one. So the missionaries, Karen didn't even own a dress. And so the missionaries, we're getting ready to go to the church, if you will, when they invite us to attend church, says, maybe there was a question, I'm not really sure, how should we dress? And so they said, well, the women don't normally wear a dress. And so we had no money, which was typical of students at that time and today too. So Karen went out and bought a pattern and some stuff, and she knitted 2 dresses so she could go to church. Well, give an idea. The dresses were halter top dresses, so it was completely bare in the back, no need for a bra, and so off she went to church.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So you mentioned, and I was going to ask you about that. You mentioned not a lot of life changes necessary for you. Uh, so that didn't sound like it was that hard of a transition for you.
Well, it really wasn't. There was just a realization that I talked about, and that I wanted to live up to the potential that I knew was in me.
Hmm.
And so becoming a member of the Church of Jesus Christ, it wasn't that big of a sacrifice, but it it was something that I wanted. Nobody was trying to force me into it. It was something I wanted more than anything.
Yeah.
And so it was easy to do. And Karen went along. I mean, you know, as we went through the discussions, which you did as a missionary, she had questions, I had questions, but it was easy for me. She had questions we went through. And then eventually there was a challenge for her to be baptized. Um, the bishop had been interviewing me, and so I was ordained a priest in the Aaronic priesthood. And so I was able to baptize Karen.
Hmm.
Uh, but on the morning of her baptism, one of her good friends who was religious felt like that she was joining the Church of the Devil. And so she showed up at our little apartment in Berkeley with all the books and all the stuff with another friend to try to talk Karen out of being baptized. And
Hmm.
it was in a loving way, it really was. She wasn't being mean. She was just trying to, in her mind, save Karen from making a big mistake. And so, but Karen listened to that and said, no, I think that I've had enough spiritual experiences to let me know that I'm on the right path. And so I will be baptized. So she was.
So tell me, you now looking back, I mean, you've done a lot within the church, and you've been successful outside of the church. You have a bunch of kids now. How do you think being a member of the church has affected your life versus where you think you would be without it?
It's hard to know what you would be without it. I can make some suppositions in the sense that being a member of the church has changed the focus of my life,
Hmm.
much less focused on myself and much more focused on other people.
Hmm.
Now, keep in mind that one of the biggest faults that I have that I work on from time to time is to be less um, uh, self absorbed and
Hmm.
more absorbed with other people.
Hmm.
So that's one of the characteristics of Jesus Christ that I work on most. And so without the gospel of Jesus Christ in my life and without the example of Jesus Christ, I'd be a much more selfish person, which would have not worked well in many ways. It would not have worked well in terms of being a good husband. Um, I mean, before we got involved in the church, one of the thoughts I had was the worst thing that could happen to us at this time was for Karen to get pregnant. Okay.
Right.
So after we were involved in the church, we had kind of a spiritual experience together at a state conference where we came home and decided that maybe we should start a family. And that was
Hmm.
in our first year of law school.
Hmm.
And so,
Probably the worst time that you could start a family.
and so there's a tearful experience that evening together as we flushed Karen's birth control pills down the toilet
Yeah.
with tears running down her cheeks. Is, oh my goodness, what are we doing here? And so in the end, we had one child born during our second year of law school and one born 2 weeks late, the day after I finished the bar exam.
Wow. Oh man, that had to have been stressful while you were going and taking the bar.
Well, well, it was just, I suppose, I suppose it was, but I don't know. I guess in some ways the Lord has given me a sense of easy to believe and to trust in Him, and that
Mm.
this will all work out in the end.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there was a bit of stress. There's far more stress for Karen than me
Sure.
because she had to take care of these kids, and I was busy in school and then busy in work and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so that changed my life. And in answer to your question, it changed everything. In my regular prayers, I often, if not often, if always, thank Heavenly Father for the gospel of Jesus Christ in my life
Mm-hmm.
because it is a guiding light that keeps me pointed in the right direction. That doesn't mean I'm always right where I should be, but it keeps me on track and moves me back when I try to get off track, when life gets you off track.
Mm-hmm.
And getting off track can really create problems in your life.
Yeah. So tell me what you mean by getting on track. What do you think that that means?
Well, I guess getting on track is to recognize who you are, to try to figure out what God has planned for you, and to put aside some of the um, put aside some of the temptations that occur in life that can get you off track. Um,
Mm-hmm.
as a lawyer, in what you do, and you and I did the same thing on opposite sides of the deal. Is you want to win, but win at what cost?
Yeah.
Uh, and so uh, that was always in my mind. Is that I'm not going to give up my eternal exaltation to win a lawsuit. I need to stay on track and be honest and forthright in everything that I do, and
Yeah.
not do that. And in terms of where you spend your money and how you spend your money and what you do with it. I mean, I did stupid things when I look back in terms of as soon as I made a partner, I had to go buy a Porsche.
Right.
So that's very
Right.
selfish. That's the selfish part of me coming out and look at
Right.
me and all that kind of stuff. But the Lord looks at it and goes, "Oh, he's young and stupid. I'll put up with him for a while."
Yeah. Well, I don't know anything about buying fancy cars. No. It's funny you bring that up. I remember my boss, my mentor, Roger Dreyer, definitely not a member of the church, but he's a very good man. I remember we had a case. I had a case for a guy. I had carried it on, and we were about 8 weeks from trial, and we had found out that, and this was a case. I mean, we had done $1.5 million demand, on it, and going to go try it in Placer County. Found out that he wasn't being truthful with us about what was going on, and I came down. And I sat down with him, and I go, I don't know what to do. I mean, this isn't. He's not being accurate, and he told me, he goes, fire him. He just said, fire him. And I go, it's $1 million case. He goes, there'll be another one. It's fine. It's not worth your integrity as a person to do that. And it showed me that, uh, there is more to life than winning these cases and making money. And you have to be able to look yourself in the mirror. And after that, he told me, he said, listen, you should never take a case that you're not comfortable, that you look at the person and say, I would not be comfortable sitting next to them for 2 weeks in trial. And so um, it was a big, good life lesson. So,
Well, and Roger, I had more than a few cases with Roger, and that's exactly the way he was, and it's easy to work with.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, so that kind of stuff, and helping you make decisions that have affected my life in terms of making sure that I made the sacrifices to have children. We have 5 children. Um, I I would have never had 5 children had we not become involved in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or become involved with Jesus Christ. Um, and in terms of in terms of the enjoyment of my children, they're fun to be with, and I got a whole bunch of grandkids now, and they're fun to be with, and so yeah, I'm 7 years old, and I can't believe that I'm 7 years old, but I look back at the key decision that has brought me the most happiness is becoming active in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
yeah. That's sometimes people ask me about that. I grew up in the church. Um, my whole life, I remember going to church pretty much weekly, but I don't think I necessarily had a strong conversion, probably more of a social conversion than anything. Until one day, the you know my best friend, who happened to be a female, who I hoped to one day, um, be married to said, I'm never going to marry anyone who doesn't go on a mission. And so I was like, well, I guess I'm going on a mission. And that changed my life. And it's funny because when you go all in, it really does put your life in the eternal perspective. I remember thinking to myself before I went on that mission, I'm just going to be a pro wrestler and tour the world and have a lot of fun and just wrestle and make a bunch of money and be famous and just do all that. And I remember coming back from my mission and thinking to myself, okay, so what comes along with wrestling? Injuries, never seeing your kids, never seeing your family. And I said, that's not what I want. And so um, I couldn't imagine not being around my kids all the time,
Yeah.
And so it helps you put things in a more eternal perspective, I think. And so
So, I mean, we all need that because we're all a little bit selfish. It's hard being a natural man. And so the world will cause you to be even more selfish if you listen to it
mm,
and going after the wrong things. And I mean, it's not like I've still gone after the wrong things from time to time. It was important to me to make, a good living and doing all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, I had other stuff that kind of slowed me down in terms of, not slowed me down, but was a check on that in terms of church callings that took up some of my time and trying to figure out the balance between work and church and home. Um, and that was a good exercise for me to keep me on a good path.
well, that's something I also wanted to talk to you about because you have a really cool conversion story, and then you know we talked a little bit about it off air. You didn't go on a mission, you didn't grow up in the church. You're in your 20s when you come back, and you've served in significant callings. You've been a bishop twice, you've been a stake president. How have you been able to find a balance between family, work, church callings? It'd be very easy. I've been an elders quorum president, I've been in bishoprics, I've been on a high council. It could consume your life if you let it. how,
Yeah.
how do you how have you been able to balance those things?
Well, you're assuming I did.
True, true.
um, I mean, you just kind of, it's almost like you're bouncing back and forth in terms of things, and that's part of life. I look back on it now, and it's just part of life. Uh, and so you just have to you just have to recognize that there are things, that there you have to be there. You have to, you've got a job, and you've got to do enough. You got to do enough there to, if you're a partner in a law firm, to keep your partners happy. If you want to be a partner in a law firm, to make the partners want to make you a partner,
Mm-hmm.
and to do all the stuff that's there, and that takes a lot of time. At least in my end of the business, it took a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got church callings that take up time, and you got family, a growing family, and so you're just saying which is the most important at this particular time in your life. And sometimes you choose work, sometimes you choose family, and sometimes you choose church. And you can't just say one always trumps the other because there are different needs, different circumstances. And so it's just a balancing act. And sometimes, at least for me, sometimes I got it right and sometimes I got it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I was in a situation where, either by design or just the work of faith, I had no choice but to choose one. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and that may have caused some other things to suffer along the ways. And so, being busy like that, and Karen, as a stay at home mom, I mean, she deserves all the credit for, having to deal with the decisions that were thrust upon me as the breadwinner and as
Mm-hmm.
the church guy and to doing all that. But, it was hard for her. Um, but we came out of it not permanently scarred, with our testimonies stronger than they were before, and with an appreciation for God and the sacrifice of His Son that allows us to do what we do. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's what you want, but there's no secret to this. It's just day by day.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember being in when I was an elders quorum president, I was in a kind of like a fireside council training thing with Elder Bednar, and he came and it was over at Temple Hill, and I remember someone asking him how to have work life balance, and he goes, "Listen, there's no such thing as work life balance." He's like, "Listen, what you got?" He's like, "You're one of those jugglers with plates on the sticks," and he's like, "And every once in a while something needs a spin to keep it all going." And he goes, "And that's just how it works." And so, I agree with you. Let me ask you. This is another thing that's really interesting. I think it's being a member of the church. The family structure tends to be a little bit more traditional. Usually, I think it's changing a little bit. Has changed a little bit over time in my life, but traditionally, you see a traditional family where one of the parents, usually the father, is the breadwinner, stay at home mom, and in California, that's really hard to do just because of cost of living. But how did you guys navigate the dynamic? Because I've seen a lot of my friends have this issue where when one person's going to work all the time and one person is home all the time, neither one of them kind of understands what the other one's going through. If that makes sense, like,
Oh yeah.
and how were you and your wife able to navigate that as you went through life?
Well, again, the question presupposes that we did a great job of that. We did navigate it because we came out alive and loving each other at the end, but it was difficult.
Yeah.
Um, and most of it is that I think we were lucky because Karen, even though from where you see is this, kind of shy, quiet woman, she's not shy and quiet. And so, she would just say, I can't do this. I need something to keep me on balance. And so, one of the
Mm,
things that she started to do after our second child was born is she went back to school to get her degree. And it was one, to get a degree, and two, to do something other than stay home and take care of the kids.
mm,
And so that meant that she would go to school at night. And so I had to be home at night to watch the kids.
mm.
And so, yeah, that's just everybody has to figure out. Everybody's making sacrifices, but sometimes you have to sacrifice for the other side. And a stay-at-home mom is mostly making the sacrifices for the dad to go out and earn a living and doing all that, and it has to happen. But the dad needs to make sacrifices to make sure that the mom uh, has joy in her life as opposed to just home. I mean, we've been we've had you've seen all the cars around the house. We had 3 of our daughters and 10 of our grandkids here for
Mhm.
the last week, and oh my goodness, I mean, it just a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 4-year-old boys, and then a whole bunch more up to 16 or 18. And so, the confusion, the noise, the stuff. And every time I'm around my grandkids, I recognize this is what Karen dealt with when I was at work
Yeah.
or when I was out serving. And it's just, I couldn't do it. And so, yeah, there's no easy thing. There's no way through all this.
Mm,
It's always going to be hard.
mm.
And there's good things, there's joy that goes along with it, but there's a lot of frustration that goes with being a parent of young kids.
Yeah.
Uh, there's no two ways about it.
One thing that I think is interesting, and it was explained to me one time, is that when you go to work, the thing about being out of the home and working is you have an identity outside of just being like I I come here and I'm Josh, I'm the partner at the law firm, and then I go home and then I'm Austin, Piper, Lexi, and Lincoln's dad, right? And then when I take them to their activities, I'm dad. And when you have somebody who's staying at home, they're just they have no identity outside of so and so's mom or so and so's dad, and that can be tough. And it's hard when I have one of my best friends, him and his wife, they've they kind of have this push pull that, who does what, and, who, he comes home and he's tired. She's been working at it all day and she's tired. So who takes over? And, you just, yeah, that's one of those things that you have to navigate. And tell me, how do you think, does do you think that the church provides anything for you that helps you guide your marriage relationship?
I think so, if you listen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the question, is if you listen.
Mm-hmm.
The message I get from the church, from as long as I've been involved in it, is to acquire the characteristics of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And if you try to model your life after Jesus Christ, it helps you to be less selfish, more selfless, putting other people's needs and wants ahead of your own.
Mm-hmm.
And yet sometimes the patriarchal order or the culture of the church runs counter to that, which causes men to miss the real boat. Not all men, but some men who miss the boat, who think, I'm in charge, and I've got the priesthood. And so, you should do this. And maybe he learned that from his dad, and he learned that from his grandfather. But so, yeah, for me, at least, the church was a positive influence on that. Not that I always did this right, and I would be called up short from time to time by my wife, but at least I was able to listen and not get mad at her and recognize that, yes, she's right, and I got to do better.
Yeah.
But talking about what you say is that it's hard for both sides to do that. And so one of the things I did at around my 65th birthday is I wrote a personal history. And the purpose of it was to give to my grandchildren. And the reason I did it is my grandfather wrote one and gave it to all of us when he was 65. And it was a great blessing in my life, even though I was probably only 10 or 12 when I got it. I got to see him in a different sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that Karen said as she wrote the various drafts and helped me put it together, she goes, man, I didn't realize how stressful you were, or how stressed you were with your job. I knew it was stressful, but I didn't realize just how much stress it created for you.
Yeah.
And so that's just going back and forth, not really doing that. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
That it totally makes sense. Yeah, I mean that yes, that makes a lot of sense. So you now tell me, you've served in some pretty significant callings. Like I said, you've been a bishop, you've been a stake president, and you mentioned just a little while ago, just a moment ago, you said some men get their priesthood and they kind of miss the boat on that. What do you think contributes to that? I mean, you've been counseling guys, I'm sure, for, I mean, what, 20 years? If you've done two bishop stints and a stake presidency stint, you've had 20 years of counseling members of the church. What do you think contributes to that?
That's a really good question, and I don't have a really good answer. How's that? In the
Yeah.
sense that, I mean, it could be one of the things I refer to as cultural.
Mm-hmm.
We learn from watching our parents and watching people around us as to how to interact. Even though we don't recognize that we're learning it, we kind of do that. And I learned part of that from my parents. My parents had a good marriage from everything I could see.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they didn't yell at each other. My dad treated my mom with respect, and and I realized there was tension in their marriage, in the sense that when my mom wanted to go to work, my dad really didn't want her to go to work, but she wanted to go to work, and so, but he gave in, if you will, and so she
Mm-hmm.
went to work, and that was a good thing for her. And so I, for me, it was easy because I got to watch two people who tried their best to be less selfish and to allow the other one to move forward in a way that would make them happy. So I don't know that there's a good answer to that. I don't know. You can teach it, but it's hard. It's hard to undo what happens as you grow up. But if somebody literally you know, uh, the grace of God can allow us to change in any way possible if we're willing to allow God to intervene in our lives. But you've got to get yourself to a point where you're willing to listen and to recognize some of the things that you need to change. And I believe that the Lord will help you change that. But you just need to do that. And Karen's done that through her life and made some changes. I've done that through my life and made some changes. Probably not as many as I could or should. But people that seem to do the best and find the most happiness in life are those that we hear this all the time in the church is repenting daily, trying to figure out what it is. And then asking, even doing come follow me. And, the question that came up in a couple weeks ago is, the question that's asked is, what what more do I lack? That's a scary question to ask the Lord if you really want to hear the answer to it.
Yeah.
What more do I lack? And we all lack something more than a few things.
Yeah.
And the question is whether we're willing to, or we're so comfortable with where we're at and maybe happy where we're at, and yet not being willing to ask that question and following the promptings that you get will sort of stop you from moving forward the way Heavenly Father wants you to do it.
I heard one time, I think, I can't remember who exactly it was, but I remember someone saying, if you really want to get better in your life, sit on the edge of your bed, look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, what is one thing that I am doing that I need to change today?
Yeah.
And if you really think about it, you'll find it, and it won't be something you'll like. And it'll be something that'll be really hard. But if you do that every single day, you will get better every single day.
Yeah. But that's hard. That's so hard.
It is. It is. And
But
it's not, but change for the best though. It's not, it doesn't go like this. It's up and down, and a lot of these things I tell my son, he's 16, and he thinks he's got he thinks he's got it all figured out, and then every once in a while life smacks him in the face and he realizes he doesn't, and I tell him all the time, I go, yeah, you're gonna mess up. I expect you to. It's not like you're gonna be perfect all the time. It's okay. Just accept it, be mad about it for a little while, move on, get better, and that's so. Now, you mentioned promptings, and I wanted to go into that a little bit, following promptings, because I can tell you in my own life, this is something that I struggle with, is knowing when you're getting a prompting versus when you're kind of just thinking on your own. Uh, how have you in your life, as you're looking at personal revelation, how have you found to differentiate those things?
yeah, good question. No simple answer.
Yeah.
In the sense that, on the one hand, when you hear these good brethren speak, um, follow the promptings of the Holy Ghost as if it's that easy. Oh, okay, I'll just do that. I'll just, listen and go.
Right.
And I'm not so sure that Heavenly Father wants to prompt you for every decision in your life. He wants you to figure a lot of this stuff out on your own.
Yeah.
And to maybe as you come across various decisions in your life, to work it out in your own mind and then take it to the Lord in prayer and say, have I got this right? And to find out and wait for an answer on that. And sometimes the answer doesn't come automatically. And so you have to go. And so, for me, as I try to as I've tried over my life to chart my path, I go back to my patriarchal blessing. It says, follow the prophet, follow the prophet. Even the elect will be deceived. And the only protection for you, Ned, is to follow the prophet. And so, and that's hard for some people because we live in political times, big issues are there, and sometimes, the prophet is making a statement that you kind of disagree with. And I guess for me, in many ways, that has not always been that difficult because I go back to my patriarchal blessing, and then I try to look for why the prophet's right and I'm wrong, as opposed to why the prophet's wrong and I'm right.
Hmm.
And I just believe just over a year, 70 years of living that I've never been, I've never gone wrong by following the prophet on everything. And and when I followed the prophet, even though I wasn't sure that was not sure, even though I was second guessing him, in the end I came to realize that he was so right on all this stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and so at different times in my life, I felt like I've been overwhelmed with church service and what in the world am I doing here? And yet I just, prayed about it and figured out that I'm just going to keep on until those that are above me who are inspired to know what to do will do it. And it's worked out okay for me.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I mean, and trying to look at the decisions that we're confronted with and waiting for inspiration uh, is a test of patience, and it takes a level of maturity and patience to listen carefully.
Yeah.
So, and let me finish this. One of the things that I've come to realize, for me at least, is that God will never allow me to make an important decision in my life without giving me a clear answer.
Hmm.
And so, for example, as a stake president, I had to make a recommendation to who would be a bishop when it was time to replace a bishop. And that's going to affect that person's life. It's going to affect that person's family's life, and it's going to affect many, many lives in the ward. I mean, it's a big decision that you would think the Lord would help you figure that out. And so you go through this process of trying to receive inspiration. And at least in my case, it was never a situation where the Lord just puts a name in front of my head and said, "This is the person I want to be the bishop." The Lord didn't work with me that way. He wanted me to work it out. But when the time came and I had focused on a name, I would take that name to the Lord in prayer, oftentimes in the temple, and wait for an unmistakable spiritual confirmation that this is what the Lord wanted. And I never called the bishop unless I got that. And sometimes I would do my due diligence, take a name to take the name to the temple, and not get the spiritual confirmation. So I'd start all over again
Hmm.
and do it again. And so I would do that. And so one of the things I came to realize is that the Lord calls these people for whatever reason. He always made it clear to me why. He always made it clear to me who he wanted called,
Hmm.
but he never let me in on the whys.
Hmm.
And I would find that out over the next 3 to 5 years as to the whys. And so that's a testimony of faith experience that I've had that allows me to recognize that the Lord he is in charge of this. I don't know how he does it, but he is in charge of this. And he has a plan, and he won't let us get too far off the road as these human beings do the best they can and administer in various church callings to do the best they can.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I think leads perfectly into what I wanted to one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about, and that is, for some reason, my generation in particular, um, there tends to be, I don't know if I would call it a mass exodus, but it's a concerning amount of members that kind of come from my generation who are really struggling with continuing to go to church. And I don't know, maybe it's always been like this. Maybe your generation, my parents' generation, all had this same thing in a different light. But it just certainly is alarming to me how many of my friends have stopped coming to church. And one of the things that I think has been really interesting, anecdotally, is I think that some of this comes from, when we were in the 90s kind of going through seminary, there was this idea that this concept that everything that the prophet said was gospel. And since then, the church has kind of clarified and said, well, there are times when he's speaking as a prophet, and there's times that he's speaking as a man. And I've seen that to be true serving in local leadership positions where you know I could tell these are men who are led by God, but also men who are imperfect. Perhaps you can share a little bit about what you learned about the relationship between God leading his church through these imperfect people who he's called in these leadership positions.
Well, I can only state for myself. I mean, he called me to be a bishop, an imperfect person, twice.
Mhm.
And he called me to be a stake president as a very imperfect person. And it's not like I would get up every morning. I use this example for the prophet, but I'll just use it for me. It's not like I would get up, take a shower, brush my teeth, and then have a 1 hour interview with the Savior who told me what I needed to do that day. It doesn't work that way. Um, at least it didn't work that way for me. Um, what we did, or what I did as a bishop, was a lot of thinking, a lot of pondering, a lot of praying, and watching the Lord in quiet sort of ways direct my thoughts in a particular direction. But it wasn't like a voice, it wasn't clear. It was just, okay, this is what it is. And then you counsel together with your counselors, you counsel with the ward counselor, you get all sorts of input from all these people that allows you to make the right decision. It allows you to reach a conclusion that you then take the Lord and receive a confirmation of it. One of the examples I used as a stake president with my counselors is we'd be sitting around in the table and there'd be a tough decision, to make. And in a joking sort of way, one of them once said, well, it's a good thing you've got the keys because you're on the hook for this one. And and this literally, as I was thinking about that, I was in the car, and I really think this was like an inspirational moment where the Lord, I'm thinking about that, and the Lord, the thought that came to my mind is that each of those counselors is jointly responsible with me, the key holder, for the decisions that I make. That they need to work with me to make sure that that happens. And so when the next time we got together, I said, look, guys, you're on the hook with this for me too. We need to work together, pray together, and live our lives in such a way that we reach a consensus that is acceptable to the Lord. And so, but yeah, I mean, it's not like a church leader, at least for me, and I don't think I'm that much different from anybody else. It's not like I'm receiving constant emails in my head from the Lord as to what I need to do and what's going to happen.
Sure.
Sometimes, thoughts come into your head and trying to figure out whether it's your own idea or something else. You just follow it through. You counsel with other people, you counsel with the Lord, and you make the best decisions. And I think for the most part, it works. I mean, an example of that is putting together a stake conference. I used to worry when we first started doing this that, the discussions to who to ask to speak and what they should speak on as you go around the table in a presidency meeting, trying to figure it out. And I remember thinking, this is like making sausage. It's ugly. I mean, in the sense that you don't feel, at least I didn't feel like it was obvious that the Lord was directing us what we were doing. It was just a bunch of men sitting around trying to do this. But then I realized that the Lord did direct us as I watched the stake conference unfold with people that I felt inspired to select to give a talk and inspired them to give a talk that was amazing. Like, for example, we just had a stake conference now, and those two youth who spoke, I'm sure that President Martell and all the counselors had no idea that they would be that good. There's no way you would anticipate that, but the Lord knew who they were and to what to do. I mean, and the Lord does it very quietly. I mean, there was once where I had this thought that I wanted to ask this young man who had recently become more active in the church, was getting ready to go on a mission to speak in stake conference. And I'd interacted him a little bit before you got here. We had these big bike rides that the priests in the stake would go on. And he was with us, but he'd hurt his leg or something, so he was just along helping with the sandwiches and stuff like that. So I talked to him, and he was good enough. And so I went up to his bishop at a meeting. I go, I'm thinking about asking such and such to speak at state conference. And he goes, I can tell by the look on his face that, oh, that's a really bad idea. But I guess he was more respectful of me. Maybe he should have given me the truth. But he goes, well, he's kind of shy. I think maybe he'd be okay. And so we asked him to speak. He gave a 10-minute talk without notes. It was a home run. It was unbelievable.
Wow.
And then I came to learn afterwards that 6 months before, he would only speak. He wouldn't ever talk in school. He would not talk to the teachers. And he was living with his grandparents. And the only person he would talk to was his grandfather. He wouldn't talk to his grandmother. He was so shy and so into himself. And so here, this crazy stake president wants him to speak in state conference, and he hits a home run. So here's where the Lord guided me to do that kind of stuff. But I don't recognize it at the time. I just kind of do it. Does that make any sense at all to you?
Yeah, it does. It's funny how you can really use that in a lot of aspects of your life where things don't make sense at the time. But then later on you look back and you go, wow, that was strangely perfect how that worked out. You know? And I think that you can do that for a state conference. You can do that for a big decision in your life, something that doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's where I think the revelation, to me, personal revelation seems to be hardest. It's really easy to follow personal revelation that makes sense. You know? Yeah. But when you got one like that, where it's like, that's the person you want me to call to be this bishop, that doesn't make sense at all. Or you want me to do what? I'm supposed to build an ark. I mean, like that kind of stuff is where faith really, I think comes in. Did you, when you became a bishop? I'm curious about this because I've talked to a few bishops. I've had friends that have been bishops, and they've been surprised at the the significant issues that members are having in their lives. Did you ever have a situation where you walk in or you hear some of the stuff that's going on and you're like, what is wrong with these people? Or anything like that?
No, I guess I came to the realization early on, and maybe I knew that before, is that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have all the problems that everybody else in the world has. Mm. Hopefully less, but they're still there. You still have child abuse. You still have substance abuse. You still have infidelity. You still have all that stuff. And so the idea that somehow we're this special people who are immune from all these things is mistaken. But I think to the extent that we understand the atonement and we're given guidelines by the Lord that we try to follow, it will keep us away from that. But we're just individuals, and so I think that we still have divorces in the church, but we still have less than in the world. We still have less of all of this stuff in the church. But it's still there, and to say what's wrong with this church, as a bishop or anybody else, because you still have people who are committing the stupid things that happen in the world is just sort of you're silly. You're just not going to happen.
Yeah, maybe there's just something wrong with my friends. Because I sometimes I think that some of the people who it seems like when somebody goes haywire, they really go with gusto. You know what I mean? It just seems like I don't know. It's funny. I imagine as a bishop and a stake president, you saw a lot of messy situations and a lot of really successful applications of the atonement.
Yeah, and I guess I remember most of the applications of the atonement and thinking about spouses who can forgive each other truly and allowing a marriage to succeed when you think that there's no way it can succeed, and it did. you just see people who overcome addictions, who overcome stuff that's there, um, and the atonement is so real. It's just a question of tapping into the power of the atonement and recognizing it. But people give up on themselves; they get down on themselves, and then maybe we have more of that in the church because we hold ourselves to a higher standard, and then if we fail to reach that standard, we feel that somehow we're tainted goods and we're never good enough, and that's just not true at all. It's just not true at all. The Lord will never give up on any of us.
Mm-hmm.
That's my belief. I just don't believe He'll ever give up on any of us. Life is a whole lot easier on this life if we'll follow what He has to say. But He recognizes that, and that's why His Son came. But He recognizes that if we do make mistakes, there's a path forward to get out of it. And I don't know, people shouldn't feel guilty about it. They shouldn't feel shameful, I should say. They shouldn't feel shame for making mistakes. Maybe guilty is a better term for it because they made a mistake. But the Lord forgets all this stuff. He really does.
Yeah, at some point, I think we have to learn to forgive ourselves for these things.
And that's the hardest thing is that I remember as a young bishop, there was a pretty introverted father of, and he was a teacher and he was very self-conscious of everything. And I remember having an interview with him and he goes, I'll never amount to anything in the church. He says, I'm nothing. And he goes, I didn't even serve a mission. And I said, well, let me in on a little secret. I did not serve a mission either. And that kind of perked him up because they see the bishop as this perfect person who never makes a mistake in his life and or never made a wrong decision in his life. And here's another one. If you've read President Eyring's biography, here's President Eyring. Here's one of the most spiritual, most influential, spiritually guided men you'll ever meet. When he was a young man during I think it was the Korean War, the church made an agreement with the military that they would only allow, that they would grant a deferment for 2 young men per year out of each ward to go on missions, and the rest would be drafted. And so President Eyring's bishop selected him and one other young man to get that deferment. What do you think he did? He turned it down because he thought his education was more important. Okay. Wow. So is that what the Lord wanted him to do? Probably not. But did the Lord just give up on him because, he got his priorities out of whack at that particular time? Okay. And so one of the things that President Eyring did is he recognized sort of afterwards. And so he became, at that time, a stake missionary and spent about 20 hours a week as a stake missionary while he was going to school and as a young married, young father. Wow. So yeah, it's just, there's all these things that we hold ourselves up. The joke I've always made, half truth and half what is that I can't believe anyone ever made me a bishop, let alone a stake president. I didn't go on a mission. I didn't go to BYU, for heaven's sakes. I went to Cal. But it doesn't really make a difference. Does that make any sense?
It does make sense. And the thing is that I think that sometimes people are called because of their differences in experience. I mean, you being a guy who didn't go on a mission could relate to the guy who's sitting there with you saying, I didn't even go on a mission. Yeah. I mean, that was probably exactly what I needed to hear at that time, to make himself feel better.
I feel that I missed out on the experience of being a missionary. And that's just something that I can't get back. I mean, Karen and I eventually will go on a mission, but it'll be a different experience and a different point of our lives. And so I wouldn't use it as an excuse for a young man or a young woman who feels that they should need to go on a mission to go. Well, Ned Telford did go, it didn't hurt him. That's not the point.
I tell my son who he plans on going on a mission, and I'm proud of him for that. I didn't think I would growing up. There are lessons that you learn on a mission that you just can't learn anywhere else. There's just even some of the logistical stuff, being able to live with somebody you don't know 24 hours a day for 3 months and learn to get along with them. You know, I don't know where else you're gonna get that. Planning, learning how the structure of a mission is very similar to the structure of a church, the way it's set up. I mean, leadership in those types of roles, being out on your own, learning how to budget money. I mean, a lot of stuff that I learned so many lessons that prepared me for life, that I don't believe I would have gotten anywhere else. So I think it's great. If you can go on a mission, you should. I mean, it was the best 2 years experience that set me up for the rest of my life. I can attribute every good thing that's happened to me in my life to my decision to go on a mission. And so
You know, let me get back to one of the statements you made about, so many of your peers are losing interest in the church, leaving the church, going, almost anti-church in some cases. And
mhm.
one of my callings right now is I'm the executive secretary to the Area 70.
Mhm.
And so I get to be involved with stuff almost like a fly on the wall. I get invited to these meetings and stuff like that, that I have no real role in other than I'm his executive secretary. And so, and I'm struggling with the name. It'll come to me. I struggle with remembering anybody's name. But anyway, Elder whatever came out about a year ago, and he wanted to have a meeting with the stake presidents in the Roseville Coordinating Council. There's 11 stakes in the Roseville Coordinating Council and their wives. And it was just going to be an informal dinner meeting. It was held at the Roseville Stake Center. And then I think he spoke afterwards. It was like a fireside afterwards, or a devotional. And so he spoke about this idea of what's happening in the church and the growth of the church and everything else. And so one of the things he said, and I was taking notes, and I compared my notes with Elder Wilson, who's the Area 70. I go, did I get this right? Because some of the stuff he was saying seemed so different than what my perception was in terms of where the church was. And so no, so you got it right. He says, um, the percentage of members active in the church, going to sacrament meeting, going to that, is higher than it ever had. Is higher now than it's been constantly going up since the late 60s. Okay. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the number of people who are leaving the church is lower. The worst, in terms of, it was much worse in the 70s than it is now.
Hmm.
And the number of people coming back to the church has gone crazy high. They used to have, for restoration of blessings, they had two general authorities who would handle that and to look through all the stuff and make recommendations to the first presidency. There's so many applications for restoration of blessings that they now have 8 general authorities doing that.
Wow.
And that, the growth of the church everywhere is just astounding. So if you look at what's happening in California, that doesn't give you a global view of what's happening around the world. And like the church in Africa is growing at unbelievable efforts. I mean, they're creating stakes there almost weekly as they go forward in Africa with the growth of the church there. And so his point is that, yeah, we've got issues we have to deal with, but don't think that we're in trouble. The church is in great shape, growth-wise, and everything else as we move forward. And so, have a positive attitude about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me ask you, what do you think? You've been kind of shifting gears a little bit. Like I said, you've been in a lot of major leadership positions. You talked about asking what lack I yet. What do you think we as members, just in general, currently lack that we could see? You'd like to see more of?
I'm not going to be able to answer that question. You ask me good questions that I don't really have an answer to.
Uh huh.
I can't speak for members of the church. I really don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
can speak to me and people that are close to me. And again, I think what I lack and what I work on the most is obedience. I mean, not talking about what we do in the temple, but I mean, there's enough written about it. I mean, the first covenant that we make in the temple is obedience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think putting Christ first in our life is what we all need to do, which makes things easier as we go through from there on. If we put that first in our life, I mean, that's the old primary question is, what should I do? What would Christ do? Well, I mean, that's a pretty good answer. It's a pretty good way to look at what you should do in a given situation or a decision you have to make.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea of obedience has always been forefront with me, and I tried to be obedient. And you may have heard me say this in one of the meetings we've been, but my son's mission president, President Stone, became a general authority 70 after he finished his role as a mission president. And so he stayed close to a lot of his missionaries. One of them was with my son. And so when he would have an assignment in Northern California, he'd come up and get here a day early and stay at our house and go play golf with Justin and me. And so once we were having breakfast, and I said to him, I go, how did you pick the leaders in your mission? How'd you pick them? And his answer really surprised me, but there's a lot of thought to this. He goes, well, that's easy. You might think I picked the ones who had the innate leadership principles. No, I picked the most obedient missionaries because I found that an obedient missionary I could make, with the help of the Lord, a great missionary. And I think an obedient child of God, the Lord can make him into an exalted person.
Yeah.
And so just trying to be obedient, and not that you're going to be perfect at it, but trying to be obedient to the guidelines that God has given to each of us in terms of how we live our lives, how we treat other people, how we interact with anyone else. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but that's what I worked on for myself.
Sure. When you say obedience, let me ask you this question because there's a lot of stuff. We're hearing a lot more about doctrine versus what do they call it? Policy. So when you talk about obedience, what would you refer being obedient to?
Good question. And I guess the answer would be more along the lines of doctrine, but trying to understand that the policies are there to help us to keep the doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could say that the policies are guidelines, but wouldn't you want to follow a guideline that's given to you by someone smarter than you?
Sure.
And so I think by trying to live your life in accordance with those things, you're better off. But it's easier said than done. For example, one of the things that President Nelson has encouraged us to do is to keep the Sabbath day holy. And there's been a lot of talks as to what that is. To have regular time in the scriptures, the Come Follow Me program. Doing all that stuff isn't doctrinal. How you keep the Sabbath isn't doctrinal. But the joys of keeping the Sabbath are doctrinal, but how you go about that is more policy than anything else. But listening closely to the policies and trying to see how that will bless your lives, I think will bless your lives.
Yeah, I agree. It seems sometimes my experience just in what I've seen is that some members use obedience in a very Pharisees Sadducees way, if that
Okay.
makes sense. Like not everybody for sure. I think there are some people I've seen it where we'll use the Sunday for example. I remember one time sitting in a in an elders quorum meeting, and this is an award back when I was in law school, and we were talking about keeping the Sabbath day holy. And this guy got up, very nice guy, like him a lot, still do, think he's great, but he railed on people watching TV on Sundays and just said, if you're watching TV on Sundays, that is completely against and kind of looking down on people. And there was another guy there. He raised his hand. He goes, "Listen, my dad is not a member of the church. My dad, he left the church a long time ago." And he goes, "We have a really bad relationship. The one thing that we can do is sit there on a Sunday and watch a football game together." And he's like, "I think I'm keeping the Sabbath day holy by maintaining that relationship with my father and being able to do this one thing." And the other guy wouldn't have it. The other guy just wouldn't have it. And it's so I think that it seems like it's a fine line, um, of figuring out where to be obedient when it comes to policy versus doctrine. I think so. The way I've shared with my friends when they've spoken to me about this is I said, "Listen, can you answer every question on the temple recommend interview, affirmatively?" And they say yes, and I go, "Okay, that tells you you're recommended to God, so I think you're good." Everything else, it's spirit of the law, and it's something that you got to pray about and decide on your own. But if you can answer those questions, I think you're good. What do you think about that?
I agree with that. I
Yeah.
agree with that in the sense that we got to be careful what the policies are. For example, in the last 20 years, you're not going to hear any of the brethren talk about whether you should watch TV on Sundays.
Right.
That, that's almost a cultural thing that exists out there. There's all sorts of cultural things in the church that are accepted as policies, which really aren't.
Right.
They really aren't. And so you got to be careful with, trying to be a Pharisee and to do all this stuff with no good meaning in it. I mean,
Yeah.
I look at some of this. I don't want to lead somebody astray, but I mean, I look at some of the stuff that we do on Sundays that we feel very comfortable with, that other people might think, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that President Telford would do that on Sunday." I mean, I got caught up short once when I was bishop early on, when we had little kids, and Karen wanted to go on a bike ride on a Sunday after, on a nice summer afternoon when church is over and there's nothing left to do, and take the kids on a bike ride. And I go, "I don't think that's a good Sabbath day activity." And so she goes, "You're nuts." And so we went on a bike ride, and afterward, I thought I was nuts. And there's nothing unsabbathy about getting on a bike with two little kids and having a nice time.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and then there's the joke. It's probably anecdotal and not even true about um, President Spencer W. Kimball. That he stayed at somebody's house, for a state conference, and so on Sunday when everything was over, they found him in the pool. And they go, "What are you doing out there?" And he goes, and jokingly, he says, "It's okay in the pool as long as you don't splash." And the joke he was trying to make is, it's okay to go in the pool as long as you don't have any fun. Heaven
Right.
forbid fun on the Sabbath, which
Right.
is what we do when we goof up. We're so caught up in the don'ts on the Sabbath that we forget to do the do's on the Sabbath.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. And that's I think that's something that I was it. I think it was maybe Jay Golden and Kimball who said, "Don't take yourself too dang seriously."
It probably didn't say dang.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. I didn't want to. So that's no, I agree. Now you're also currently serving as the stake communications director. Um, tell me tell me what that entails. I bet a lot of members don't even know what you do.
All right. It's a great calling. It's a little bit different than most of the other callings. And this whole idea of state communications has changed dramatically over the past 4 or 5 years. It used to be called public affairs.
Mhm.
And so public affairs was the idea that you go out and you interact with people who are not members of the church, not in a missionary mode, but to try to establish great relationships with them, help them to see the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its members in a positive light. And so that was kind of what it was then. And then they changed it to communications. And so we have kind of a two approaches, or two focuses, if you will, not approaches, two focuses. And neither one is predominant over the other. The outward focus is exactly what I talked about. And so one of the things we do is I establish relationships with Bishop James Soto, who's the bishop of the Catholic or the Sacramento Archdiocese. I've established a relationship with John Jackson, who's the president of Jesuit University, which is a Christian college located in Rockland, and other people that we deal with for various things. And I'm not trying to convince them they're not going to ever join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but yet they become positive ambassadors to other people about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They say, hey, these are good people. They believe in Jesus Christ. They do all this. And so that's part of what you're doing, is putting that happen. The other part is more inward focusing, and that is you get all these emails from me, saying, what about this? You need to take a look at this, or whatever the deal is here, to let members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, our case, our stake, know all the good things that the church is doing, so that they recognize that this church that they're a part of is a big part of the community. And so you get emails from me saying, the Church of Jesus Christ just donated $10 million, and I may have the number wrong, to a LGBTQ outreach program to help these people with some of the issues they're going through. And that bothers some people, that the church is doing that. But if you look behind what they're doing, they're just being the way that Christ would interact with these people. He wouldn't say, get out of my life. That's not the way he dealt with anyone. And so you see the church going out with groups that we had a terrible relationship with, the NAACP, that now we have a great relationship with, because the church is doing that. And so one of the things that we're tasked to do as a communication is to find ways, in various different ways, through social media, stake web pages, to highlight some of the good things that the church is doing throughout the world. Does that make?
Yeah, no, that's definitely makes sense. So maybe if the communications director, you could talk. You mentioned the LGBTQ community. The church's relationship with that community, I feel, has gotten much better, and I think feelings within the church have progressed quite a bit on some fronts within that community. Perhaps you could shed a little more light on what you think that the church has been doing to kind of bring that community together with us.
Well, I think basically what they do is they just accept them,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that they go, you are God's children. He loves you as much as he loves me. And so, um, and then, the church draws the line, which offends some, but is acceptable to others, who draws the line and says that, hey, the fact that you have same-sex attraction does not mean you're a sinner, you haven't done anything wrong. It's just that, we still have, and it will never change, the law of chastity. And so, you know, if you violate that law, um, that's not acceptable to God. It's not that he's necessarily going to punish you, but you're denying yourself some blessings in this life, or maybe in the life to come. And so it's a difficult situation. And I think for people who, parents especially, and siblings, and those who have same-sex attraction, when it's very close to them, they just have a hard time coming to grips with that. And it is difficult. I mean, we've gone from 100 years ago, where if somebody had same-sex attraction, you figured they had no, that's a choice they made, and that they made that choice, they're a sinner for making that choice. And I've come to realize that it's real, and there's just no denying it. And so, for me to pass judgment on them in terms of how they feel and how they interact with, I'm not there. I mean, obviously, from a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have to deal with it. But the Lord will deal with it, and the Lord will deal with it mercifully, I'm quite sure.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's an interesting thing you bring up parents. I know some parents who've dealt with this, and Yeah, it's a hard pill to swallow when you have somebody that you love who has, who is part of that community, and the church's stance being that, you know, to be an active member of the church, you have to not have had, you can't have a relationship like that. You can't get married. You can't do those things, and that's a struggle. That's a struggle for people to hear when you have someone you love, especially when you've had a relationship that's been good and it's been such a big part of your life, that you have somebody that is expected to essentially if they want to stay a member of the church and go through the temple and do those things, to stay single their entire lives and never know of a first kiss, a first handhold, of a first kid coming into the world. That's a struggle. It's tough. But I will also say this, and I've shared this with some people who are on the other side of this, who maybe are a little more conservative, if you will. I don't know if that's even the right word, in their beliefs on this, and that is that I think that, you know we know that God is a perfect judge. Thank goodness we're not the ones that have to judge. But if God is a perfect judge and there's something that was beyond their control, something that was placed in them for whatever reason, whether it's environmental, genetic, whatever it is, I got to think that God, being a perfect judge, is going to take that into account when they get to the judgment bar. And
I am confident it will, but I don't know that. But I'm
mhm,
confident it will.
mhm,
Um, just because everything that the Lord does and everything that Jesus Christ does and has done indicates that he is merciful.
yeah,
And even to those who go against his teachings, he is merciful. And different situations. I mean, it's just so different. I mean, people grow up in different aspects, and to judge somebody who grew up and never really had the opportunity to listen to the gospel of Jesus Christ, uh, who rejects it, I mean, you can't judge that person. Only the Lord can figure that one out.
sure. That's very true. And like I said, luckily we're not the ones that have to judge that. I think every single person on earth is just trying to have a very real human experience. You know, um,
Yeah, and some people ask the question, you know, why did Karen get this life-changing spiritual experience that changed my life and the lives of our children? Why doesn't everybody get that experience? And I don't know the answer to that. It's
yeah,
true. It happened. It wasn't in our imagination, but and I don't know that. And I don't put it into the idea that, some of the evangelicals, not all evangelicals, but some of the evangelicals who believe that, we were born to this life and we're sinners and God's given up on us and there's no hope for us. And there's those that he really likes and he gives these blessings to, and you're just not on the list. And I just don't think it works that way.
yeah. And it's funny too, because when you talk to somebody, that was one of the things when I was on a mission that I thought was so interesting, was that I'd run into some of those people who think that way, and to me it's so foreign, but to them that's just the way it is, and that's just the way they've accepted it. And it's just so interesting how they can almost have the same conviction in their beliefs as I have in mine. And I
Oh,
just
yeah.
find it so interesting.
Well, and that can be troubling, actually. It can be very troubling. My son is with the FBI, and he ended up taking an assignment in Iraq. And he still, to this day, won't tell me what it is he did in Iraq, what the FBI was doing in Iraq during
Mm-hmm.
the war. But he was kind of taken aback by the genuineness of the Muslim people and what they believed and how it affected every aspect of their life. And how can they, like, Dad, how can they be that convinced that they're right? And I'm so convinced that I'm right. Are we both wrong? And it's just, it's hard to know.
Wow. Yeah. Well, listen, I've had you on for a little while. I have a few questions I ask everybody I want to pose to you. You ready?
Okay,
Okay. So, first one, what would you say is your biggest success in life?
my kids.
Yeah, the ones I've met have all been pretty good. You did okay.
Well, they are a blessing to my life. They actually like each other and like being around each other. And it's, they're just good.
Yeah.
They're fun.
Yeah. I'm actually, that's one thing as a parent. I've said this a billion times. This is my favorite time of being a parent because they're just so fun to watch them grow up, and I can't wait to see where all my kids end up. You know what I mean? Like where what they end up doing in life. It's I just am so proud of all of them. You
Yeah.
know that I think they're all going to do great.
You know, when I
Um,
say my kids, that's too shallow. My kids, my grandkids, the family.
mhm.
Um, Obviously, my wife is a key to all that, but they just bring joy.
Yeah, that's awesome. What would you say is your biggest failure, and what did you learn from it?
My biggest failure, my biggest failure. Well, I don't know that I could say that I failed at something. I have regrets about missing out on opportunities to do things.
Hmm.
For example, a mission. Um, I never had a failure that rocked my life in any sort of way I had a stroke, as you know, which that's not a failure. That's just a life event that goes on
Hmm.
that changed the way I was.
Hmm.
Um, I guess the overarching worry of my failure is that I haven't done enough. I
Hmm.
haven't been spiritual enough. I
Hmm.
haven't been as good a husband as I could have been or
Hmm.
should be now. I
Hmm.
haven't been as good a dad or a granddad. I always
Hmm.
work, I always worry about that in the back of my mind that I could have done more. And the answer is yes, you could have.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
but
Yeah. You know, real quick, I know I've had you on here for a little while, but I do want to talk about your stroke a little bit because you had a stroke at a very interesting time in your life, right before you were going to be called to be a bishop a second time. And you said something off air when we were preparing for this that you said that you felt like something to the effect that you thought the stroke was exactly what you needed at the time, or something to that effect. Can you kind of just briefly talk about that?
yeah, probably career wise, I was at the apex of my career. I was one of the two senior partners in a law firm of about 50 lawyers. Um, was a managing partner with the other senior partner. We were in charge of everything, the way our firm worked. I mean, you basically, it was a benevolent dictatorship. How's that? Uh, but we were benevolent and, we didn't line our own pockets with the money, but I was making more money than I ever thought I would make. And there was more money to be coming in the future. And so then I had this stroke. And so um, I tried to go back to work and it would not work. And so I just decided that I needed to, leave. And so I did that. In the meantime, um, I'd gotten a call from members of the church who were listening to this. I got a call from the executive secretary for the stake president saying that President Wood would like to meet with you and your wife on Sunday. This was like Wednesday or Thursday. And my wife was actually out of town. Um, and and I knew that they were looking for a bishop, but it never crossed my mind that it could be me because I'd already been a bishop about 15 years earlier. But as soon as I got that call, I thought, oh no, this is what it is. I just can't believe this. The Spirit witnessed to me that you're going to get called as bishop. Better get yourself ready for it. Whereas before, when I got called as bishop, the Lord let me know 6 months in advance. I put it in my journal that I'm going to be called as bishop, which made no sense because the bishop hadn't even He was at like 3.5 years. And so,
Hmm.
there's no reason for that to happen. But I put it down and it ended up being there. But anyway, so on Friday, I woke up and I'd had a stroke in the middle of the night. And it didn't affect me physically, but I couldn't speak. And I didn't know my name. I didn't know anybody's name. I didn't know my wife's name. I knew she was my wife, but that was it. And I would open my mouth and I couldn't make any noise come out. And I just couldn't form a word. And so Karen figured it out, took me to the hospital. Um, and I remember one of the things that I remember is that I had to sign the intake form. And so I had this pen in my hand and I thought, I don't even know my name and I don't even know how to write. So end of story there. But anyway, so stake president came and saw me in the emergency or when I was admitted, and he later shared with me his journal entries. And so he went back to his counselors and said, Ned's had a stroke. He can't talk. He's not in good shape at all. But nobody has any idea what the prognosis is, but it's just, he certainly can't serve in his current capacity. And so both of his counselors said, well, we need to go someplace else. We need to start looking again. And so he said, and here's the faith of him and the brave. He was convinced that the Lord wanted me to be the stake or be the bishop. That was the clear impression that he'd gotten, and he couldn't figure out how he could get that so wrong. This goes back to how do you know when it's your idea or when the Lord's telling you to do that? And so he expressed that to them. They prayed about it and decided to just shelve it for a week or two. And so they came back and they prayed about it. I wasn't much better. I knew my name, but I couldn't put a sentence together. And so he, as an act of faith, issued that call to me to serve as bishop. And it really wasn't so much about me. I'm more impressed with him than me, in the sense that that's what the Lord wanted for me to be the bishop. And from a selfish standpoint, it was the best thing that could have happened to me in terms of a recovery standpoint, because when you've had a stroke like that, you feel so self-conscious about your ability to do anything because you sound so stupid when you try to talk and you can't put a thought together, or you wander off as you go this. And so I could have just reverted into a shell and not gotten much better. It would have been easier to do that. Just to sort of avoid people from the embarrassment of not being who I was. But by having this calling, I had no choice. And so the Word put up with me, and everybody put up with me. And after about 6 months, I was probably about 85% of normal. I still have little things that now and again that most people wouldn't know about. But yeah, and so it's an interesting thing that how the Lord directs his church and the faith of people, in this case, President Wood, to understand that he got it right and that that's what the Lord wanted for Ned Telford to do.
So we talked off air, I mentioned, because you eventually would become a stake president, and you said there were some things that you think you learned in that second stint as bishop that helped you later as a stake president. Um, could you kind of give us a little bit more of an idea of what that was, and how you think that helped you?
I guess part of it helped me in the sense that I had to taste I had to taste a big dose of humility,
Mm.
because I'd always been, in terms of my role as a lawyer, successful and self-confident. And so I remember thinking that the Lord had taken away from me all the things that I needed to be a lawyer.
Hmm.
And and so I had to deal with that sense of humility, and it caused me to be a lot more grateful for things that I did have and to see the good in life that I didn't. I became far, far less competitive, whether that was by design or the competitive part of my brain was destroyed with all the other parts. Um, but it just made me a better listener because I couldn't talk very well, so it was much easier to listen. And to have a better insight of people who who didn't have all the skill levels that I felt like I had before, and were doing the best they could with a limited set of skill levels or a limited whatever it is that they had to, that was their life, and I felt that way, and I could see how they felt that way, and I think it made me a better person.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would be curious to see. I couldn't imagine a life where my competitive edge was diminished. It's just so ingrained. It'd be really
Well, it is. I
interesting.
mean, that's part of being a trial lawyer. It's like
Yeah,
single combat warrior. You know, you're
yeah,
in, and and there's rules that you have to follow, but the idea is to win with the
yeah,
rules. Like one-on-one basketball is the best example I can think of. Is you're
mm,
out there to win. You got a referee that keeps everything in line, but it just winning didn't make any difference to me after that. It really didn't.
yeah. That's so interesting. I don't know what that would be like. My
Yeah.
son my son and I we were it was funny. I took them down. I took my kids down to the Golden One Center. I got to a couple hours on the court where the Kings play, and I got caught up in this 5-on-5 game, and we just we were down 6-1, and then I was integral in helping us get up back in, and then we were up 10-7, and we ended up losing 12-10. And I was so angry I threw the ball across the court. I was so mad to lose. And it was just so funny because my son was like, "This is pickup basketball. It doesn't matter." And I'm like, "It does matter. It matters. Winning matters." It just
Well, competitiveness, I was thinking about this today. There's a positive side of competitiveness in the sense that competition who makes you try the hardest to do your best and to get better. There's nothing wrong with that. But winning to win because somehow that makes you feel better about yourself, that you're better than this other person. There's nothing good that comes from that.
that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that we got to talk about those things. I have one more question that I ask everybody, and that is that at some point, you're going to pass away, and when you do, there'll be a funeral. And I can tell you just from everything I know about you, it will be a large funeral. There'll be a lot of people there, and someone's going to give your eulogy. What would be the one thing that you hope someone would say in your eulogy?
That he tried his best to develop the characteristics of Jesus Christ. But I'm not sure they're going to say that.
Yeah.
In fact, you talk about a eulogy. I told my kids once, we do our adult kids once every 2 or 3 years, we take them on a vacation, a nice vacation. Like we're going to Costa Rica next fall and or next spring. And so I got them together on one of these vacations, and I go, okay. And they didn't do it. They didn't really do it. I go, I'm going to lock you guys all in a room. I want you to write the eulogy for Mom and I because I want to hear all the good things because I'm going to be dead. But I'd like to hear it live. uh,
Oh man, I don't know. My some
but
days I
yeah,
don't
I
know
mean,
if my kids
eulogies,
would say
it's a
anything
really
else.
good question. I gave the eulogy, my father in law passed away, who was stepfather in law. He's not a member of the church. And you guys may have known him, but probably not. But he was a federal district court judge, Ed Garcia,
Mm. Oh,
and
okay.
so and and so there were two eulogies, and I was one from more of the family, and then there was Justice Brennan or Judge Brennan who did it more from the the lawyer side or the judge side. And when I was talking to him beforehand, he goes, "It must have been really intimidating to be dating Karen and Judge Garcia, who had a reputation of being tough." And I go, "No, he was just Ed to me.
Yeah.
He was just Ed to me." And so I'm to my kids, I'm dad. I'm not Bishop Telford or President Telford. I'm just dad. And I don't even think they think about any of that kind of stuff. I hope not.
Man.
So,
Well, well, that's awesome, and you've been a great example. I can tell you that you've been a great neighbor, and you've been a great example to me. Um, and you can see it through your kids and your grandkids. I had the privilege of being the Sunday school teacher to two of your grandkids. Both went on missions, both excellent people, and you obviously have a lot to do with that. So, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's
all
been
right.
good. It's been good to get
Well,
to know a little bit more about you.
for those that are listening, when Josh asked me to do this, I said, you must be at the bottom of the barrel if you do. But I don't talk about myself very often, and it's nice to ask for somebody to ask questions that force me to talk about myself. But anyway, thanks for what you do, Josh.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And for everybody who's listened, subscribe. We got a lot more fun stuff coming up. In addition to Ned Telford, we've had WWE wrestlers, and we've had, therapists and all sorts of different people. So keep on listening. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next week.